At 2 a.m. on a frigid Colorado night, Federal Agent Marcus Chen approaches his family's mountain cabin after months of undercover work. But as his key turns in the lock, a flashlight blinds him. "Freeze! I'm calling 911!" screams his neighbor, HOA President Linda Hartwell. What she doesn't know is that her obsession with property rules is about to collide with a federal investigation that will expose corruption reaching the highest levels of their mountain community. The snow crunched beneath Marcus Chen's boots as he approached the rustic cabin nestled among the towering pines of Eagle Ridge, Colorado. It was 2:17 a.m. on November 15, 2023, and after 6 grueling months undercover in Denver's organized crime scene, all he wanted was the peace of his family's retreat. The cabin had been in his family for 30 years, a sanctuary inherited from his grandfather, where the most dangerous thing should have been the occasional black bear. Marcus fumbled with his keys in the bitter cold, his breath forming clouds in the mountain air. The federal agent was exhausted, his cover as a small-time money launderer finally blown after a successful sting operation that netted 17 arrests. His phone buzzed with congratulations from his task force, but all he could think about was hot coffee in his grandfather's old leather chair by the fireplace. "Freeze! Don't move another muscle." The voice cut through the silence like a knife. A powerful flashlight beam hit Marcus square in the face, temporarily blinding him. He instinctively reached for his weapon, his training kicking in, but stopped when he recognized the shrill tone. Linda Hartwell stood 20 feet away on her porch, wrapped in a pink bathrobe and wielding a flashlight like a weapon. At 58, she was the self-appointed guardian of Eagle Ridge's Homeowners Association, a woman who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and documented every violation with photographic evidence. Her perfectly styled gray hair was now wild from being roused from sleep, but her eyes burned with the fervor of someone who'd finally caught their white whale. "I'm calling 911 right now. You have no business being here," Linda shrieked, already dialing her phone. "This is private property, and I know for a fact the Chens haven't been here in months." Marcus slowly raised his hands, his keys still dangling from his fingers. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus Chen. This is my family's cabin. I have every right to be here, liar." Linda's voice echoed off the mountain walls. "The real Marcus Chen is some kind of criminal who abandoned this property. I've been watching, documenting everything. You people think you can just come and go as you please, turning our neighborhood into some kind of drug den." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. During his undercover work, he'd necessarily maintained distance from his personal life, including the cabin. He'd paid all his HOA dues remotely, but clearly his absence had fed Linda's paranoid theories. "Listen, Mrs. Hartwell, if you'll just let me explain." 911, yes. "There's a break-in happening at 847 Pine Ridge Road. Send officers immediately. The suspect is Asian, approximately 6 feet tall, dark clothing. He's trying to break into the Chen property." Linda's voice was triumphant, as if she'd just solved the crime of the century. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The last thing he needed was local police involved while he was carrying his federal credentials and service weapon. His cover identity was blown, but the paperwork hadn't been processed yet. Any police database check would show conflicting information that could take hours to sort out. "Ma'am, please, just let me show you my ID." "Stay back. I know your type. You drug dealers are all the same, thinking you can intimidate honest citizens." Linda backed toward her door, still shouting into her phone, "He's approaching me now. Send backup." Marcus realized the situation was spiraling beyond control. Linda's misconceptions about his identity and the property were about to create a nightmare scenario. He could hear sirens in the distance, their wail growing louder as they wound up the mountain road. He made a calculated decision. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and withdrew his federal credentials. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Agent Marcus Chen with the D. This is my badge and identification. I'm not a criminal. I'm a federal law enforcement officer, and this is legally my property." Linda's flashlight beam wavered as she squinted at the badge. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face, but then her expression hardened again, fueled by months of suspicion and self-righteous anger. "Nice try. You can buy fake badges on the internet. I've seen the shows. You people will try anything." She was practically screaming now. "I've been documenting everything. The strange hours, the long absences, the suspicious activity. I know what's really going on here." The sirens were getting closer. Marcus could see the reflection of red and blue lights beginning to flicker through the trees. In minutes, he'd be surrounded by local officers who might not immediately verify his federal status, especially given Linda's frantic accusations. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're making a serious mistake. The only mistake was letting your kind into our community in the first place." Linda's mask of neighborly concern finally slipped, revealing something uglier beneath. "We've had nothing but problems since your family bought that cabin. Always coming and going at weird hours, never participating in community activities. Real Americans don't behave that way." As the first police cruiser rounded the bend, headlights sweeping across the scene, Marcus realized this wasn't just about a mistaken identity or an overzealous HOA president. Linda's behavior, her surveillance, her immediate assumptions about his character, it all pointed to something much deeper and more disturbing than simple neighborhood paranoia. The police car door slammed, and two officers approached with hands on their weapons. Marcus kept his credentials visible, but his mind was already racing ahead. Linda Hartwell had just made this personal, and federal agents didn't forget when someone tried to destroy their lives with false accusations. What Linda didn't know was that Marcus Chen specialized in investigating organized crime and corruption, and he was about to discover that his quiet mountain neighborhood harbored secrets far more dangerous than anything he'd encountered in the urban underworld. The fluorescent lights in the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department cast harsh shadows across Marcus's face as he sat in the interrogation room at 4:47 a.m. Despite producing his federal credentials and having his identity confirmed by his task force supervisor, the night had devolved into hours of paperwork and bureaucratic confusion. Linda Hartwell's accusations had triggered a complex jurisdictional review, especially given Marcus's recent undercover status. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 50s who'd known the Chen family for decades, finally entered the room with a steaming cup of coffee and an apologetic expression. "Marcus, I'm sorry about all this. Linda's been difficult lately, ever since she became HOA president 2 years ago. We've had more complaints from Eagle Ridge than the rest of the county combined." Bradley slumped into the opposite chair. "But this time she crossed a line, filing a false police report, making those comments about your kind. My officers heard everything." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, his federal training telling him to stay calm, but his personal anger simmering beneath the surface. "Tom, I need to know exactly what she's been saying about my family and our property. This isn't just about tonight. That's what worries me." Bradley pulled out a thick file. "She's filed 17 complaints about your cabin in the past 8 months. Alleged suspicious activity. Claims about drug trafficking. Demands that We investigate your family's criminal connections. I dismissed most of it as HOA nonsense. But now what? Now I'm wondering if she's been running some kind of harassment campaign. Bradley's expression darkened. Marcus, there's something else. 3 other minority families in Eagle Ridge have filed complaints against Linda in the past year. Similar pattern. Surveillance, false accusations, attempts to get them investigated or force them out. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountaineer. As a federal agent, he'd seen this before: organized efforts to intimidate specific groups under the guise of community safety. Tom, I need copies of everything, all her complaints, all the reports filed against her, everything. Already thought of that. Bradley slid the file across the table. And officially, of course. But Marcus, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I'm thinking Mrs. Hartwell picked the wrong federal agent to mess with. Back at his cabin as dawn broke over the mountains, Marcus spread Linda's complaints across his kitchen table. What he found made his blood run cold. The documents revealed a systematic campaign of harassment that went far beyond neighborly disputes. Linda had filed complaints with the county, the state environmental agency, the IRS, and even Homeland Security, all targeting the same handful of families. She'd claimed the Patel's Diwali celebration was a terrorist gathering. She'd reported the Martinez family's Quinceañera an illegal immigrant smuggling operation. She'd accused the Johnson family, the only black residents in Eagle Ridge, of running a drug operation based on their teenage son's friends visiting after school. But the Chen family had received the most attention. Linda had documented every visit, photographed license plates, and even submitted evidence of suspicious activity that was clearly fabricated. One report claimed she'd witnessed large cash transactions on a day when Marcus knew his elderly parents had simply hired a contractor to fix the cabin's roof. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his partner at the G, agent Sarah Rodriguez. Heard about your mountain drama? You okay? He called her immediately. Sarah, I need a favor. Can you run a background check on Linda Hartwell? Approximately 1965. Address 851 Pine Ridge Road, Eagle Ridge, Colorado. Already on it. News travels fast in the federal building. Give me 20 minutes. While waiting, Marcus drove to the Eagle Ridge Community Center, where HOA meetings were held. The building was empty, but through his federal contacts, he'd learned that all public meetings were recorded for community archives. If Linda had been making discriminatory statements publicly, there would be evidence. Mrs. Chen, the elderly Korean woman who managed the community center, recognized Marcus despite not seeing him for months. Marcus, so good to see you. Your parents worry about you working so much. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you about Linda Hartwell and the HOA meetings. Have you noticed anything unusual about how she treats certain residents? The older woman's expression immediately shifted. She glanced around nervously before speaking in a lower voice. The woman, she has brought much unhappiness to our community. She speaks badly about families who look different, says things that make my heart hurt. But people are afraid to challenge her. What kind of things? At last month's meeting, she proposed new community standards that would restrict cultural celebrations and require advanced approval for gatherings. Everyone knew she meant no more Diwali lights, no more quinceañeras, no more Chinese New Year decorations. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. She said communities work best when everyone shares American values. Marcus felt his jaw clench. Do you have recordings of these meetings? Yes. But, she hesitated. Marcus, she has lawyers. Rich lawyers. They send letters to anyone who opposes her. The Patels almost moved away because of legal threats. Sarah's call interrupted them. "Marcus, you need to hear this. Linda Hartwell isn't just some racist HOA president. She's connected to a network we've been tracking. Her ex-husband is Robert Hartwell, currently under federal investigation for money laundering through real estate transactions. She's been using horror complaints and legal harassment to force minority families to sell their properties below market value." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. "Let me guess. There's a pattern of who's buying these properties. Bingo. Shell company called Mountain Vista Acquisitions. Owned by Robert Hartwell. They've acquired 6 properties in Eagle Ridge in the past 2 years, all from families who left after facing harassment campaigns." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Linda wasn't just a bigoted neighbor, she was part of an organized scheme using racism and legal intimidation to manipulate the real estate market. The federal government took a very dim view of civil rights violations, especially when they involved organized criminal activity. Marcus looked out at the mountain community he'd loved since childhood. Now seeing it through the lens of a federal investigation, Linda Hartwell had made the mistake of targeting a DEA agent. But more importantly, she'd violated the civil rights of American families who deserve to live in peace. "Sir, I want to file a federal civil rights complaint. But first, I'm going to that HOA meeting next week, and I'm bringing friends." As he hung up, Marcus realized that Linda's 2 a.m. confrontation had been the beginning, not the end, of their conflict. She'd wanted to drive him out of Eagle Ridge, but instead, she'd just invited the full weight of federal law enforcement into her carefully constructed scheme. The hunter was about to become the hunted. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with tension as United States v. Hartwell began. The ornate courtroom, with its polished wood panels and soaring ceilings, had seen many cases, but rarely one that combines civil rights violations, real estate fraud, and a homeowners association gone rogue. Linda Hartwell sat at the defense table in a conservative navy suit. Her lawyer, the expensive Edward Morrison, whispering urgently in her ear. Across the aisle, federal prosecutor Diana Martinez shuffled through a mountain of evidence that had grown substantially since Marcus's initial complaint. Marcus sat in the witness section, no longer the exhausted undercover agent from that November night. Months of investigation had revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond Eagle Ridge, involving multiple communities across Colorado where similar patterns of harassment and forced property sale had occurred. Judge Patricia Hawkins, known for her no-nonsense approach to civil rights cases, called the court to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today because the defendant stands accused of violating the civil rights of multiple families through a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation." "Ms. Martinez, your opening statement." Prosecutor Martinez rose, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Your Honor, Linda Hartwell didn't just make noise complaints or worry about property values. She weaponized racism and legal intimidation to terrorize families into abandoning their homes. She filed false police reports, made fraudulent complaints to federal agencies, and coordinated with criminal associates to manipulate real estate markets for profit." Defense attorney Morrison countered immediately. "Your Honor, my client is a concerned citizen who was protecting her community's property values and safety. If some of her complaints were overzealous, that's not a federal crime. This is government overreach. Pure and simple." The first day of testimony established the pattern. The Patel family took the stand, describing how Linda's complaints about their Diwali celebrations had escalated to false reports about terrorist activity that resulted in a Homeland Security investigation. Mrs. Patel broke down describing how her children had been afraid to play outside after neighbors began watching their house suspiciously. She called my husband a terrorist because he prayed in our backyard. Mrs. Patel testified through tears. Our children heard the neighbors talking. They asked me why people hated us. But it was on the second day that the case took a dramatic turn. Prosecutor Martinez called Marcus to the stand, and his testimony about the night of November 15th electrified the courtroom. Agent Chen described what the defendant said to you that night. Marcus's voice was steady, professional. Mrs. Hartwell refused to accept my federal credentials. She stated that your kind didn't belong in the community, and the real Americans don't behave that way. When I tried to explain my legitimate presence at my family's property, she became increasingly hostile and racially specific in her language. Morrison objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. The defendant disputes this characterization. Overruled. The agent is testifying to his direct experience, but Morrison wasn't finished. During cross-examination, he attacked Marcus's credibility. Agent Chen, isn't it true that you were living a double life, operating under false identities? How can this court trust anything you say? I was conducting authorized undercover operations against organized crime. Marcus replied evenly. My work was legal and supervised by federal agencies. But you lied professionally for months. You're an expert at deception, aren't you? Judge Hawkins intervened. Counsel. Agent Chen's undercover work is not on trial here. Then came the moment that would define the case. Prosecutor Martinez approached the witness stand with a tablet. Agent Chen, I'm showing you People's Exhibit 47. Can you identify this recording? Marcus listened to the audio, his expression grim. This is a recording of Mrs. Hartwell speaking at an HOA meeting on October 3, 2023. Please, play it for the court. Linda's voice filled the courtroom. Clear and unmistakable. We need to be strategic about this. These people respond to pressure, file enough complaints, make enough noise, and they'll realize they're not wanted here. The Martinez family is already talking about selling. Once they're gone, we can make sure the right kind of people move in. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Linda's face went pale as she recognized her own words, recorded without her knowledge, by a community member who'd grown disgusted with the HOA's direction. But Morrison fought back with his own surprise. Your Honor, I'd like to call Robert Hartwell to the stand. Linda's ex-husband entered the courtroom in shackles, having been transported from federal detention where he awaited trial on money laundering charges. His testimony was devastating, but not in the way Morrison had planned. Linda wasn't just filing complaints. Robert testified, his voice barely above a whisper. She was scouting targets for our operation. She'd identify minority families, harass them until they wanted to leave. Then I'd have Mountain Vista Acquisitions make lowball offers through intermediaries. We flipped 17 properties this way across 3 counties. Morrison's face went ashen. His own client's ex-husband had just implicated her in a federal racketeering scheme. Mr. Hartwell, Prosecutor Martinez asked, did your ex-wife know about the money laundering aspects of these property acquisitions? She knew everything. She kept detailed files on every family we targeted, called a community improvement. But it was all about the money. The defense table was in chaos. Morrison was whispering frantically to Linda, who sat frozen as her own criminal conspiracy unraveled in real time. Judge Hawkins called for a recess, but as the courtroom emptied, everyone knew the case had fundamentally shifted. What began as a civil rights violation had exposed a criminal enterprise that used racism as a tool for financial gain. In the hallway, Marcus overheard Morrison on his phone. "We need to discuss a plea agreement immediately. My client is looking at 20 years minimum if this goes to the jury." But as Marcus headed to the prosecutor's office for debriefing, he had no idea that the biggest revelation was yet to come. Hidden in Linda's detailed files was evidence of a connection that would shock everyone in that courthouse, including Marcus himself. The real mastermind behind the Eagle Ridge conspiracy was someone Marcus knew well, someone he'd trusted, someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than any racist neighbor ever could. The jury filed back into the Denver federal courthouse after 3 days of deliberation. Their faces grave and determined. Linda Hartwell sat rigidly at the defense table, her expensive lawyer having already begun damage control conversations about sentencing recommendations. The courtroom was packed with residents from Eagle Ridge and reporters who'd followed the case's shocking revelations about organized real estate fraud disguised as community activism. Judge Hawkins surveyed the room with the authority of someone who'd presided over complex federal cases for 2 decades. As the jury reached a verdict, the jury foreman, a retired teacher from Roar, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. How do you find guilty on the charge of wire fraud in connection with real estate transactions? Guilty on the charge of filing false reports to federal agencies? Guilty." Linda's composed facade finally cracked. She gripped the defense table as Morrison placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. In the gallery, the families she'd terrorized, the Patels, the Martinez family, the Johnsons, sat with expressions of relief mixed with the exhaustion that comes from a long fight for justice. But Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. The court will now hear victim impact statements before sentencing. Marcus watched as Mrs. Patel approached the podium, her voice stronger now than it had been during the trial. "Your Honor, Linda Hartwell didn't just file complaints about our family. She tried to erase us from a community where we'd built a life. My children asked me why their neighbors hated them for celebrating our culture. No child should have to ask that question in America." One by one, the victims spoke. Each story added weight to the scope of Linda's campaign of harassment. The Martinez family had spent $30.00 in legal fees defending against false complaints. The Johnsons had briefly enrolled their son in private school after rumors spread through the community about their family being involved in drug trafficking. When it was Marcus's turn, he looked directly at Linda before speaking. "Your Honor, as a federal agent, I've seen organized crime operations that were less systematic than Mrs. Hartwell's campaign against minority families. She used racism as a business model. And that's something that strikes at the heart of what America is supposed to represent." Judge Hawkins nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Hartwell, you will be sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay restitution totaling $847,000 to the families affected by your actions. Additionally, you are permanently banned from serving in any homeowners association leadership position." As the judge's gavel fell, Linda was led away in handcuffs. Her reign of terror over Eagle Ridge finally ended. The courtroom began to empty, families embracing, reporters rushing to meet deadlines, justice seemingly served. But as Marcus gathered his paperwork, Prosecutor Diana Martinez approached him with a troubled expression. "Marcus, we need to talk privately." In her office 20 minutes later, Martinez closed the door and activated a white noise machine, standard procedure for sensitive conversations. "During our investigation of Linda's financial records, "We found something that changes everything about this case." She placed a bank statement on her desk. Mountain Vista Acquisitions, the shell company buying the harassed family's properties. It wasn't just owned by Robert Hartwell. There was a silent partner who provided the initial funding and legal protection that made the whole operation possible. Marcus leaned forward, studying the documents. The account showed regular transfers from an entity called Alpine Legal Services, substantial amounts that had funded not just property acquisitions, but also the legal harassment campaigns against minority families. Alpine Legal Services is owned by... Martinez paused, watching Marcus's face carefully. Thomas Bradley. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sheriff Tom Bradley, the man who'd apologized for Linda's behavior, who'd provided files to help Marcus's investigation, who'd known the Chen family for decades. "That's impossible," Marcus said. But even as he spoke, pieces were falling into place. Bradley's intimate knowledge of Linda's complaints, his dismissive attitude toward earlier victims who tried to report her harassment, his subtle discouragement of families who wanted to fight back. Martinez continued relentlessly. Bradley wasn't just taking bribes to ignore Linda's activities. He was the mastermind. Linda was the visible face of the harassment campaign, but Bradley provided the legal muscle and law enforcement cover that made it work. When families tried to file complaints against Linda, Bradley would discourage them or claim there wasn't enough evidence. The full scope of the betrayal washed over Marcus, the friendly sheriff who'd offered coffee and sympathy that November night had been orchestrating the entire conspiracy. Bradley had used his position to provide Linda with information about which families were most vulnerable, had delayed or dismissed legitimate complaints, and had even used his law enforcement contacts to add credibility to Linda's false reports. "To federal agencies, we have wiretaps," Martinez continued, Bradley and Linda discussing which families to target next. Bradley providing Linda with personal information about residents that could only have come from police databases. "This goes back 5 years, Marcus. He's been running variations of this scheme across 3 counties. Marcus felt a cold rage building. Tom Bradley has been sheriff for 15 years. How many families has he helped drive out of their communities? We're still counting. But there's more. Martinez pulled up another document. "Bradley knew exactly who you were that night when Linda called 911. He recognized your name immediately and saw an opportunity to derail any potential federal investigation by discrediting the primary witness." The courthouse steps were crowded with media as Marcus emerged into the afternoon sunlight. Reporters shouted questions about the verdict, about justice being served, about closure for the victims. Marcus ignored them all. His mind focused on the larger truth that was about to emerge. 6 months later, Thomas Bradley stood in the same courthouse where Linda Hartwell had been convicted. The former sheriff, stripped of his badge and facing his own federal charges, would ultimately receive a 12-year sentence for his role as the true architect of the Eagle Ridge conspiracy. But for Marcus, the real victory came the following spring. The Eagle Ridge Community Center hosted its first annual Unity Festival, celebrating the diverse cultures that made the mountain community stronger. Children played together regardless of their backgrounds. Families shared food from different traditions, and the mountain air was filled with laughter instead of suspicion. Linda Hartwell had called 911 that November night thinking she was protecting her community from an outsider. Instead, she'd unleashed a federal investigation that exposed corruption reaching the highest levels of local law enforcement and ultimately made Eagle Ridge a place where all families could truly bellow angst as Marcus watched his elderly parents teaching neighborhood children how to fold origami cranes. He realized that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in foreign countries or urban streets, but in our own communities, against those who would use fear and hatred to divide us. The mountain peaks surrounding Eagle Ridge stood as eternal witnesses to both the darkness humans could inflict on each other and the light that emerged when justice finally prevailed. If you've experienced housing discrimination or harassment from HOA officials, know that federal civil rights laws protect you. Document everything, save all communications, and don't hesitate to contact the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Your community should be a place where every family feels safe and welcome, regardless of their background or culture. Stand up for your neighbors, speak out against discrimination, and remember that silence enables those who would use hatred as a weapon. Like this video if you believe every American deserves to feel safe in their own community. And subscribe for more stories about justice prevailing against corruption and discrimination.